Alright, I'm Braden Dreiling, and mine is on campaign finance. Its effects on elections and evolving democracy. Most people think campaign finance is extremely boring, but it has a huge effect on how politicians are elected and what they do in office. One of the popular beliefs is that increasing the amount of money raised by the politicians therefore increases the incumbency advantage and decreases the value of democracy. Because if people raise more money, the political action committees, interest groups are buying the elections, or what many people think. There has been quite a bit of legislation pushed lately, especially in the mainstream media, to reduce the amount of money that can be raised by politicians. So that's just what most people understand to be the best idea, but I will say why that is not. The incumbents already have a very large advantage in name recognition, campaign finance, pork barreling, and war chest. Name recognition is huge in elections because a lot of people aren't willing to go get informed. If they recognize a name, they're much more willing to vote for that person because they know that politician is a good person or is going to help the community. Incumbents also have pork barreling or patronage, so they can pass legislation that helps certain interest groups. And then these interest groups then go and expect legislation to be passed for them once the money is raised. If they donate money to the campaign, they want something in return. So they have that patronage, and then candidates do back and forth. One thing I found, incumbents receive a lot more money from interest groups than challengers. So I chalk that up to that the interest groups are willing to put money with guaranteed winners. People they expect to win because they know they're going to get more bang for their buck. Here's some donations to incumbents and challengers in the 2010 congressional elections. As you can see, incumbents outraise challengers by a very large margin. PAC contributions $635,000 on average to incumbents, were only $48,000 to the challengers. Why are the PACs donating this money to the incumbents? Because of the patronage. They've received legislation and they're helping each other out. Incumbents always raise more money, and open seat races are always the most equal. As you can see, the orange bar are hopeful challengers, Republican, and the red bar are the Democratic hopeful challengers, and they're outraised majorly by their competitors by almost $500 million every race. So that's huge. They're at a major disadvantage before the race starts. And like I said before, people see these numbers right here, and they just look at these graphs and they say, well, they're getting outraised, that's why they're losing, because the interest groups and PACs are providing that money. But one of the major things is the challengers receive a much larger return on investment than incumbents. Why? Because incumbents already have a higher name recognition. Their spending isn't as effective, where challengers are building up more quickly. They have to spend to be known. If we reduce the amount that candidates could raise, the challengers wouldn't have enough money to actually get a good return to actually compete in the election. And this is the graph that kind of throws the popular belief out the window. You can see the losers are spending under $500,000. And right here in the orange, the challenger losers don't spend the money. It's nonpartisan. But in order to win, they spend over almost 1.5 million more per campaign. But they still are outspent. But since there's a much higher return on investment, they can compete and therefore win the election. With the previous graph, the open seat winners, or the open seat raised almost equal money. Well, the loser was outspent by $500,000. That shows return on investment is huge in these elections. You have to spend money effectively to win. in Brazil, they have a pretty similar model of elections, and they don't have the incumbency advantage that the U.S. has, because they don't have the pork barreling as much, and they have more parties, which help the challengers. But there's only 68% incumbent success rate. Currently in the U.S., in the House of Representatives, is 90% success rate for incumbents, and in the mid-2000s, that was upwards of 95 to 98%. With this model, we're better able to evaluate the effects of campaign spending. And one of the coolest things I saw was in Brazil, 1% increase in spending brought increase of votes by 0.5%. So there is a really, really good return on investment of spending in Brazil. So some policy recommendations I would have, I think the first step would be to make something more transparent. If you have a transparent system, then the interest groups aren't necessarily buying out as people believe. See who's actually donating the money and see how that's affecting the policies that are being passed. One thing, it would be hard to regulate, but not allowing politicians to accept money from the specific interest in which they regulate, because that would take all of that out of the window, and it would reduce the influence of PACs and interest groups, because they couldn't put a big sum of money to a politician that they're regulating. Campaign finance's effect on democracy. If we limit the amount of money raised, it limits the competition. And in business, we know competition is good for the consumer. And the end product here is democracy. And increasing spending increases the amount of well-informed citizens, it increases the amount of competition, and therefore increases the value of democracy. If the campaign finance limits are reduced, then the incumbency advantage will increase. Incumbents won't have to election or campaign as hard for elections, and there would be no competition. And it would just keep building on top of itself, where incumbents would have 100% guaranteed when they're running against a challenger. Conclusion, that restricting campaign finance increases the incumbency advantage and reduces the quality of democracy. So I argue that it is actually against the popular belief that limiting campaign finance is actually very bad for elections and for democracy itself.
All right, very good. Frank, questions?
How does it increase democracy exactly?
Because it's kind of like a business model.
Mm-hmm.
Competition is good for the consumer, and if there is no competition, what makes the incumbent go out and campaign? They already won the election, because the challenger won't be able to raise enough money to actually pose a challenge. So the incumbent doesn't have to go out and inform the citizens. They can do more of what they want. There'd be more of a disconnect, lower voter turnout, and in the end, voters have very little say in what happens once a politician's in office.
So this is not restricting it, gives them the better, to be honest, they're already at a disadvantage, but it gives them less of a disadvantage and helps them compete better.
Yeah, because they have that high return on investment.
So we seem to have a situation where we have a democratic deficit in this country. Low levels of trust, civic engagement, voter turnout, any of those measures that we would use as a proxy for the health of a democracy are in decline. We have the amount of money going up even when that money is regulated. That leads to this conventional wisdom that obviously it's the amount of money suppressing democracy. what you're doing is making a counterclaim to conventional wisdom. It's backed up certainly by data, but people have a way of ignoring data and holding on to conventional wisdom. So the question is, how do you convince people that the conventional wisdom is wrong?
I think that's tough because it's a logical fallacy, a causal fallacy, a cause and effect, that they're both happening, but one is not necessarily causing the other. And I think that's what the misconception is. I think if people actually see all of the data, they're more likely to understand, because that first graph that I showed shows incomes are raising so much more money, they're winning. But the second one, when challengers don't spend that money, they lose. But if they can spend enough to compete, they can win elections. And I think that's the major difference. They can be outspent, but still win due to that higher return. But I think people have that conventional wisdom, like you said, and it'll be hard to convince anyone to really believe that. It takes like the legislators and lobbyists to really understand what the effects of this are going to be and what the consequences, especially unintended consequences. So, because if they do, and then incumbency advantage increases, I guess maybe in 10 years, 20 years, they'll be like, oh, that was wrong. But that's 10 or 20 years where the incumbency advantage just keep increasing, which it really can't much more. At 90%, which came down from 95 to 98.
With Brazil as the counterexample, one of the things that we've talked about separately here is that Brazil is a troublesome counterexample, partly because of its party system. Because one thing that people would say about your argument here is that the reason incumbency advantage is not as significant in Brazil has less to do with the amount of money going in and more to do with the fact that how the money is distributed. The money goes to political parties, they choose their own nominees, they back people based on a prioritization example, and that's why you see the differences. How do you respond to that criticism that Brazil's a bad example because of our low power party system?
Okay, I would say the difference is that there is more party control in Brazil, but the whole goal of the Brazilian model is to show that, to display the return of investment or return on investment when there is no incumbency advantage, and that provided the best opportunity because Brazil doesn't have that incumbency advantage. So it shows the actual return on investment numbers more accurately than a system with the incumbency advantage, because that incumbency advantage isn't affecting the return for either party. It's more equal, I would say. That would be my counter argument.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, Braden, thank you very much.